So anyways, I was just thinking that I would wear this wig just for fun since I've worn it for a class presentation, so like why not wear it for a video as like a symbolic gesture how this is not the type of content I normally make and how I don't think I'll ever make this content again, you know? I don't know, I just thought it'd be a fun gimmick to work with and Hi there! Have you by chance ever heard of a movie called Sonic the Hedgehog 3? It hit movie theaters just before Christmas, it currently has the highest ratings of any video game movie on Rotten Tomatoes, and it recently surpassed $1 billion in the box office. So even if you haven't seen it, you might have at least heard of it. I've seen it, and I liked it quite a bit. Yes, it is because I'm something of a Sonic fan myself, so obviously it was going to mean something to me, but I've also heard plenty of non-Sonic fans who lifted their arms up and went absolute cinema. So that to me says that it's a fun and enjoyable movie that anyone can enjoy whether or not you're a Sonic fan. However, this doesn't mean I'm going to ignore its problems nor downplay anyone who dislikes the movie. In fact, one of my mutuals on Blue Sky said that they didn't like the movie because they felt that it relied too much on catering to the Sonic fans, the poor pacing offered very little development in a lot of its ideas, and that the humor was very overbearing and weird in many points. Not necessarily an opinion I agree with, but one I can empathize with and am willing to hear out in a real discussion. Especially since I believe that there are infinitely better ways to have a discussion than by not doing it at all. And let me tell you, Matt Walsh is someone who consciously prefers to not have any discussion at all. Like when he uploaded a video sharing his thoughts on Sonic 3 and... For the record, this didn't even leave his target audience. A lot of these dislikes came from his audience, by the way. So I might as well remove the sugarcoating and say that Matt Walsh is one of my least favorite content creators of all time, but no, it's not because I happen to disagree with him politically. But I prefer not to judge someone's value solely on their favorite side of the eagle. For instance, Shady Durags is one of my favorite YouTubers currently active, and he's openly right-wing, and I've even seen his livestream explaining his political ideologies. I do disagree with some of the things he said, but as a content creator, I just think he's really good at critically analyzing media, and I enjoy his reviewing style. Also, he's one of the only right-wing YouTubers I've seen that doesn't shoehorn any agendas or woke/anti-woke chicanery in videos it doesn't belong. And at the same time, I can't stand Jello Apocalypse, as a content creator or as a person. Yet in several regards, I'm probably about as left-wing as he is. I personally prefer to judge YouTubers by their style of video making. Sometimes I like and subscribe. Sometimes I feel that their videos are poorly made. Sometimes I respect them even if their style isn't for me. Sometimes I think they can make insightful arguments in videos, but still don't like or respect them because I actively dislike the way they present themselves. So when I say that I hate Matt Walsh as a content creator, it's because of how his videos are made and how he shapes his online persona. And I think this video is a good place to elaborate on that. Based on how he comes across in the videos I've seen, he has a very single-minded and dogmatic style where his opinions are developed around what he thinks something should be. And when it comes to reviewing media, he prefers reviewing it from what he wants it to be rather than what it wants to be, if you catch my drift. Plus, in moments like his review of The Dark Knight, he also does that thing from CinemaSins where he takes some arbitrary nitpicks and amps them up as actual problems despite the fact that no, they're not. Both of these traits are my least favorite genre of reviewing things, and it was already prevalent throughout much of the early and mid-2010s, and now I gotta see it come back in the form of The Daily Wire, complete with getting angry over cartoons. Oh hey, speaking of this guy, I just want to point out that if the guy who's often labeled as the face of angry YouTubers who take children's entertainment way too seriously is able to make multiple videos looking back on himself and say things like, okay, I'll admit that this style of reviewing was cringy, then I think this style of reviewing might be cringy. But let's be real here, no one's gonna be a perfect reviewer. I'm not a perfect reviewer. People make mistakes and happen to misinterpret things. It happens. And even this mindset is something that everyone is susceptible to at some point if they want to make reviews consistently. But when you base the bulk of your media critiques in such a way that heavily implies that your perspective is absolute, despite being very personal, not something everyone can relate to, at best, it shuts down any and all discussion and often takes the piss out of real film criticism. Or even worse, you could make a video like Matt Walsh's Sonic 3, the film that broke me as a father. Okay, right off the bat, I'll admit I'm not a father myself. Yet. The most experience I have is as an uncle with a 7-year-old niece, very young nephews, and more squirts to look forward to. So when Matt says that he believes the film is too dark for a kids movie, I don't feel like I have much of an authority to criticize him for believing that. Although another angle I can look at this through is that one of my brothers is a father who also aligns with Republican values. And I've had multiple talks with him about what I can and shouldn't introduce my niece to as she watches more shows and movies, because she is sensitive to those scary parts. Yet I also think it's important that she consumes as much media as possible as she grows older and starts to understand what media tries to do and how it affects a person. In fact, I actually hit him up when making this video, and he mentioned how my niece engages with movies very differently from how I did at her age. Bear with me, I have an overarching point to make here. I enjoyed watching faster-paced cartoons and playing Sonic games, but my niece has a harder time keeping up with stuff like that, which is why she doesn't watch a whole lot of feature-length content, at least without taking a break. You see, my brother's wonderful in how he actually pays attention to his kids in this sort of way, so I respect his decision to hold off on letting her see one of the Sonic movies, because I know that it isn't because he thinks the movie is bad, as he's also a Sonic enjoyer, and it's perfectly okay with me playing the games with her so that she can get to know the characters. It's just that he also knows that she's not yet at an age where she's able to consume certain movies without a risk of overstimulation. And I'm sure there are gonna be plenty of people, some of which might even appear in the comment section of my video, who say that their similarly aged child didn't have any trouble like this, and I'm glad for people who notice that. Every child is different in this regard. I've had movie theater experiences where I'd see a kid crying because something scared them, or at least where a kid will cover their eyes until the scary thing goes away. I'm sure that you've seen at least one kid who was like this, and maybe even you were that kid growing up, who knows? I certainly went to school with someone who was very sensitive to these kinds of scary parts. She was 17 at the time, but you get what I'm saying. Look, I'm a big advocate for saying that kids are smarter than we think, but when it comes to consuming media, a child's experience is going to be way different than the people who make this claim. Maybe one of Matt's kids is like this too. Maybe he thinks about this when taking his kids to see a movie. But either way, it's really hard for me to tell because I don't know how old his kids are, nor do I know how they handle colors on screen. So it would be disingenuous for me to act like I would know more about parenting than someone who's actually a parent. And experiences like how my brother raises his kids are things that I want to keep in mind before I become an ace dad myself. So I'm not going to criticize him for believing that a movie is too dark for kids, because maybe he's just repeating what his kids are saying and is trying to word it in a way that his audience will understand. But there are things from his perspective that I can criticize him for, and it's things like,
I wasn't tracking it that closely, to be honest. I was mostly fighting to stay awake.
You blithering ponce!
Oh hey, speaking of that clip, I would just like to say that there's a good reason why I wanted to make a day-long ranking retrospective of Death Battle, instead of something like, say, James Bond movies. For what you said about sacrifices at the beginning of the video, if you're gonna tell me that you lost track of the movie and didn't even bother paying attention for the most part, that tells me you didn't put in any real effort into understanding what you're supposed to do when leaving your comfort zone. Therefore, I don't think you should be reviewing kids' movies. Now, I'm sure that you have some passion for film as a medium, as that has been a side focus of yours lately, but you've only ever been involved with documentaries and one sports comedy, and I'm pretty sure none of them were made with a young audience in mind. So you're not really adding anything to the conversation. Although, side note, I would like to say that that day-long ranking I mentioned is, in fact, a full day long. Yes, it may be a mega compilation of videos made over the course of just under 2 years, but all parts total up to just over 24 hours. Eat your heart out, LS Mark. I don't see you making rankings this long. Although to anyone who saw this ranking retrospective in its entirety, you get bragging rights in the comments. Yes, he said that he hadn't seen the other 2 Sonic movies, and I'm also well aware that you don't need to be a chef to know if food tastes good. But none of those defenses apply if you claim to be a head chef despite not owning a restaurant. Especially since the criticisms he does bring up are surface level at best. He gives a simplified plot synopsis and says that the film plays its destroy the world plot completely straight and doesn't try to deviate from it in any way. Okay, but the thing is, it's not trying to deviate. It's adapting a story from Sonic Adventure 2, a game released in 2001, which while probably still wasn't that original of a concept, as far as the series was concerned, it absolutely was. See, the thing about the recent Sonic movies is that they've mostly tried doing their own thing, with only some references to the games here and there. But Sonic 3 is the most faithful a movie has been to a point where it's the only one that fully adapts one of the games. Sure, it still made some minor alterations like changing Maria's personality to be more bubbly instead of kind-hearted, thereby giving the character more agency, and it even took some other creative liberties by paralleling Shadow's relationship with Maria with Sonic's relationship with Tom, but the core ideas and themes are still present, and in my opinion, I think these changes worked at enhancing the story. This movie used Shadow as a formidable foe that stands in the way, and later on, a representation of what Sonic could have been if he was consumed by revenge. And then as Shadow looks up at the stars one last time, he remembers what Maria's words were supposed to mean to him, as Sonic consoles him on how pain can be overcome as the sun shines above the earth. It's so well done, such great cinematography. But Matt didn't know any of that and didn't bother doing any research, even though it's that easy. His only specific critiques are in the form of complaining about the dance sequence between Ivo and Gerald, as well as the line that says they're being played by the same actor. As for the former, okay, I'll give you that one. I didn't think it needed to be as long as it did, and I also wasn't too keen on the final fight between them, as I thought that the pacing was really bad there. But as for the latter, dude, that's just a fourth wall joke, which is the payoff to a realization of how they know so much about each other that it feels like they're the same person. Yet he describes it as a way of talking down to the audience, even though he eventually calls it a fourth wall joke later in the video. So like, what are you blabbering about and why? It's like he misunderstood the joke in his initial argument, but then nonchalantly understood it by complete accident. I'll admit that I was stone-faced through the majority of the jokes, and I can also admit that not every reference works for me. Like, there's this one scene where Sonic randomly references the opening line from Sonic Adventure 2. While I did the soy boy Leonardo DiCaprio point, like, I understood that reference. At the same time, when you look at it in context, it is kind of going against what the original line was supposed to convey. In the movie, he's saying it to a gun officer he was directly working with, while in the game, he said it to someone who was trying to detain him. So because of this, I can empathize with his main argument on paper. He thinks that the comedic bits and darker tones of the movie clash with one another, and that there's no coherent pacing between them. But in the context of how he said it, which is how he described the film overall, I think he might be misunderstanding how Shadow was utilized in the movie. There was a coherent structure when it came to balancing the drama and the comedy. When Shadow's on screen, the film starts taking itself seriously, be it through high-stakes fight scenes or calmer moments to show off his backstory. But when Shadow isn't on screen, the film decides to be more fun, be it through charming banter between Team Sonic or wacky Jim Carrey shenanigans with the Robotniks. The only times they blend together are when Shadow and Robotnik are in the same area. It's true that Shadow's more serious demeanor clashes with Robotnik's jovial motions and actions, but this is just a common dichotomy you see in children's films. I do think it's a coherent structure that any kid would be able to understand, even if they don't realize it right away. But then again, I don't think he'd care about any of that, given that he eventually says,
Like every other voice actor in this film, and most voice actors in most children's films that have been made for the past 20 years, he has no talent as a voice actor and doesn't understand how to act with just your voice.
Really?
20 years. No good voice acting in children's films. 20 years. Like, okay, I know he said most and not all, but at the end of the day, you do realize how many Pixar Renaissance films you're lumping in within that time frame, right? Okay, this could be hyperbole, as I've heard that this is a common theme with his style of comedy. Or lack thereof. But he isn't making a joke here. He's attempting to make a genuine criticism. He says that he likes Keanu Reeves, but claims that he's incapable of voice acting. So with this in mind, a part of me feels like he might be expressing a fundamental misunderstanding of how voice acting works. Now, we've all heard the criticism of this actor's just using their normal voice to play a character, and while it's usually a valid complaint, at the same time, if you really think about it, a lot of the most iconic voice actors really don't alter their voices as much as people think. When you listen to some of the most iconic voices in animation, and then you listen to the voice actor speaking normally, there isn't a whole lot of substantial difference barring something like a minor pitch shift or different mannerisms. But this is where the acting part of voice acting comes into play. Just because you happen to recognize an actor's voice doesn't mean they're not playing a character. Let's take a look at Keanu Reeves' Shadow voice and compare it with both his normal voice and his John Wick voice. Keanu off the set is surprisingly a wholesome guy, and his voice isn't that gruff.
Okay, so I'll do some fight scenes and then John Wick will get hit by a car, and that's Jackson Spidell, who's an amazing stuntman and is really going to be breathtaking. You're breathtaking. You're breathtaking. You're all breathtaking.
But then you jump to his roles as John Wick and Shadow, and things start to get a little different. He is using similar voice techniques since they're both sardonic characters motivated by revenge following the loss of a loved one, but the roles he plays still feel distinct. His performance as John Wick has less energy and more menace with dormant, lingering fury.
So I guess you have a choice. You want a war? Or do you want to just give me a gun? Whoever comes, whoever it is, I'll kill them. I'll kill them all.
While his shadow voice has more energy and active anger.
The more you talk, the harder I want to hit you. And here I thought you cared for them. Especially the one, what's his name? Tom.
Even though some voice actors use similar voices for different roles, like with this film in particular, Ben Schwartz's Sonic voice has a lot of influence from his Dewey voice, for instance, the characters being played are still distinct enough to feel like different characters. But then again, that's only a part of me feeling this way, as I have no idea what he's trying to say. I could be reading too deep into this, but am I? He's giving me nothing to go off of. Not even a vague anecdote like, this voice was annoying. Or a common error like accidentally mistaking voice acting for writing. You know, like in the vast majority of sub versus dub discourse. All he really said was that the voice acting was bad and Keanu Reeves isn't able to act with his voice because... And this is an especially incompetent omission in what's supposed to be a movie review because Reeves' shadow voice has been well received by so many fans and critics. Not to say that you aren't allowed to dislike the performance, because you absolutely are, but you have to understand that you're going in with the unpopular opinion, so you need to do as much elaboration as possible. Maybe you could point out how he doesn't have a lot of versatility in his voice, which makes some lines during key emotional moments not land as well. Maybe you could point out moments where he's slipping into a less distinct character, and at times ends up being too similar to his John Wick voice, or even his normal voice. Even if you couldn't show footage because of copyright or whatever, you could have at least mentioned specific scenes that you were able to recall Shadow in, like you did with Jim Carrey's Robotnik. But you don't do that for some reason. Instead, he makes bold assumptions with no evidence, like this.
Because this movie, again, like so many kids' movies these days, is not the fulfillment of anyone's creative vision, because nobody who made the film actually cared about making a good film, and they have absolutely no respect for their audience.
Mate, Jeff Fowler is a Sonic fan and even helped work on cinematics for one of the games in the past. Not to mention that Tails' voice actress was chosen because she's the current voice of Tails in the games and other Sonic media. Plus, some of the other actors who were less familiar with the games did deep dives into the characters just to figure out who their character really is and how they should go about voicing him. The hell you mean no care for their audience?
This movie could have been made by AI. They've effectively been doing that for 20 years now.
Yeah. This movie. Made with AI. The film series that very famously had to redo Sonic's entire design from scratch because of backlash, which very few film studios ever do, by the way. Also, could you run that by me again, please? 20 years? AI animation? When AI animation wasn't even a talking point until last year? The year before that? Maybe even the year before that? You got a source to back up what you're talking about, fam?
My source is that I made it the fuck up.
Okay, so I guess there's no reason to take you at face value. Then again, this isn't a video I would normally make. You may have had some bad takes, but given how viral this video went, at least as far as social media discourse is concerned, other people would have called them out for me. I could find bad faith takes of the movie anywhere on social media. But this last point is why I wanted to add something in this conversation.
You might respond that, well, this movie isn't for me. It's for kids. It is possible to make a children's movie that, although it's for children, is still a good, high-quality piece of art. I don't hate children's movies just because they're for children. Quite the opposite. As a father of 6, I've watched many, many children's movies. Okay, I've watched way more than the average person because I have so many kids. A few nights ago, just as an example, we watched the movie Iron Giant with my kids, and that's an animated children's film. It's also well written, beautifully illustrated, brilliantly performed, tonally consistent. It's funny and heartwarming, and at points it's sad, but it works all of that in a way that feels natural to the story.
Let's break this down. On the one hand, I agree with Matt that the "it's made for kids" rebuttal doesn't work as a defense in this situation. Matt is a parent who took his kids to see the movie, so he's allowed to criticize the film in whatever way he pleases. Most kids don't watch these movies by themselves, let alone in movie theaters where they would need to drive to, and I'm pretty sure that their toy Jeep is not gonna cut it. Heck, I'd even go further and say that the defense has been completely lost in translation. At least when I first heard this rebuttal, it was always in response to YouTubers screaming about a cartoon and taking it too seriously. Like when Mr. Enter took a throwaway line from Patrick and called it the worst Patrick moment of all time because he assumed it applied to how Patrick behaves in every SpongeBob episode, and then went on an overdramatic monologue on how Patrick betrayed him or something. The criticism works because it's just a throwaway comedic line in a show that never had a lot of care in its continuity to begin with, so in this case, he was taking it too seriously, and now you know why he dislikes the video so much. And there's also this part right here.
I can tell you that my kids were by far the youngest people in attendance. There were multiple groups of adults, just adults, no kids, who bought tickets to Sonic the Hedgehog 3.
Okay, technically this is one of those "my perspective is the only right one" moments, but it's something I can at least vouch for. My theater experience was pretty similar to his, where there were mostly adults and only some kids. Heck, I even sat next to a couple of adults who were massive Sonic fans themselves, and I was geeking out with them over every member berry the movie threw at us, and I won't spoil the post-credits scene, but let's just say we were bar none the loudest people in the theater during that point. I had a blast. Plus, Matt touched upon something without realizing it. Even though it's a kids movie, it was also a movie marketed for Sonic fans, young and old, and each of these movies added various Easter eggs and references for Sonic fans to pick up on. This means that anyone who's trying to argue this being a kids movie is essentially wrong. These are family movies, not kids movies. But with all of that being said, saying that a movie is made with a younger audience in mind can still have merits depending on context. Like, instead of saying something like, "Bro, it's a movie for kids," you could say something like, "You gotta take it at its level." This, at least the way I use it, implies that you can judge the film on its own merits and elaborate on what you liked and or disliked about it. At this point, you would be adding something substantial to the conversation and offering a more understandable perspective, which is yet another issue I take with YouTube critics like Matt, where they rarely do that and possibly make comparisons that don't make sense to me. To go on yet another overarching tangent, I'm more of a gamer than I am a cinephile, so I hear a lot of talks about escapism, and I'm often confused by people who complain about a game failing to provide an escape for them. To me, it implies that video games aren't allowed to say anything about the world we live in. Not all games want to transport you to a dream world after all, and it's pretty obvious when it does. Like, if I wanted to escape from whatever stress I was feeling, I would play a game like Mario Galaxy or Odyssey, which take me to multiple magical worlds and let me get lost in its cozy gameplay. Or a game like Bomb Rush Cyberpunk, a game that's meant to be an homage to older Sega games with its colorful low-poly graphics and stylish sports vibes. And by extension, I would play the original Jet Set Radio for the same thing. However, sometimes I don't feel as stressed out about my life and would want to play a game that tells a riveting narrative in its own unique way. If I wanted to scratch that itch, I'd play a game like Yakuza, a realistic fiction series with insightful messages and a more serious emotional tone. Except for when you check out the side content, but the main story has the more grounded and deeper stuff I'm looking for. Even a company like Nintendo has games that fill a certain role different from Mario, like Fire Emblem Three Houses, a game with a super complex plot with varying stories that help you see it from different perspectives, each one going over who's in the right and who's more in the wrong, but ultimately leaves the story up to the player's interpretation once they explore everything it has to offer. And there's also the modern God of War games, where even though they take place in a fantasy world, the story feels more introspective and does a lot of deep dives into Kratos' story and character growth, and is used as an allegory that can resonate with people in the real world. Or a game like Asura's Wrath, a game that relies on the player's sympathy towards Asura's tragic story through its dramatic cutscenes, beautiful music, and quicktime events. Though you could also argue that this is escapism in its own unique way, and depending on what you mean by that, I would agree with you. But the aspects that I mentioned are things that critics like Matt Walsh are failing to acknowledge, if not outright ignoring. Like, do I want to play a Sonic game, or more relevantly, go see Sonic 3 in theaters for an emotional story with an important lesson for me to learn? No! I go for something that's fast and fun because that's how the series advertises itself, and it's what I grew up loving about the series. Yes, the emotional beats from Sonic 3 works for me, and yes, Sonic games can have compelling stories and good writing, but those are merely bonuses on top of an already good game, or things I can appreciate in something I don't care for as much, like Sonic Heroes. I admire the story, and how some of the characters were written, and I also think the presentation is godlike, but those are respectable props I'm giving for a game that I don't enjoy playing, and don't think is particularly well designed. Certainly not for a game you need to replay 4 times just to get to a finale that is adequate at best and worst. But still, doesn't change the fact that those positives exist. Very few things are actually 100% good or 100% bad, and the more people that realize this, the better. And as a longtime Sonic fan, I've come to realize that the series has never had a true masterpiece, and that it probably never will, even if it did come close within one hand's worth of examples. Not in the sense that I'm excusing mediocrity, or defending a billion-dollar corporation, or whatever malarkey people want to accuse me of, but in the sense that I played so many games outside of Sonic. Games that have touched me on a personal level, wowed me with how it takes advantage of the medium's versatility, or just felt like a fundamentally flawless game. Games made for kids are more than likely never going to be on that level for me, so it's better to take one of the games for what it is and go from there. There may be some surprises here and there, like I enjoy the story of Shadow Generations a lot more than I thought I would, but I don't usually get something like that with Sonic. And with that in mind, there are times where you do take something at its level and are still let down by it. With Sonic Media in particular, I found the Knuckles miniseries very disappointing. I found Sonic and the Secret Rings one of the most incompetently designed games I've ever played. I was bored and unimpressed when I watched the first season of Sonic Boom, though I would argue that the second season is pretty great, but I digress. Heck, Sonic Chronicles is my least favorite video game period, because even if it accidentally elicited some very funny lawsuits, the game made far too many bafflingly terrible design choices that ended up bothering me more than a sloppy GBA port ever did and ever will. But no matter what opinions I have, I also acknowledge that I'm approaching it from my personal perspective, which is generally going to be different from others. And this is the best segue I can muster from my other problem with Matt's content, and by extension his counter to the "it's just a kids movie" rebuttal, when he brings up the Iron Giant. He's using this as an example of a good kids movie, and to his credit, he's correct on that front. The Iron Giant is a phenomenal and important movie that everyone needs to see at least once in their life, assuming they're able to understand its messages. But the problem here is that Sonic Movie 3 is not trying to be like the Iron Giant. You see, Sonic 3 is an action comedy movie, while the Iron Giant is more of a science fiction drama, so no duh it's gonna have better emotional beats. Regardless, I'm sure we could spend another hour or two dissecting the full list of differences between the two movies, but then again there is also the elephant that somehow Mateus is completely unable to see despite the fact that it's right there, man! Sonic 3 is a live-action movie with CG animals. The Iron Giant is a fully animated movie, so already you're trying to unironically compare two different mediums, which alone should have some fundamental flaws in a comparison. But even ignoring that, going off of how they advertise themselves, it's pretty obvious that Sonic 3 says it's going to make much more of an effort to feeling like an action movie, whereas the Iron Giant's trailers definitely seem to be veering more towards the comedy side, with some emotional beats here and there, which is something that Sonic 3's promotional material never implied. The comparison Matt's making is in line with those older indie YouTube reviews that basically said, well, this one movie and this one cartoon were for kids, and it made me feel things, so everything should be like that. I've always found it to be an unnecessarily gatekeepy and low-key toxic mindset that implies movie can't just be fun above all else. That's like saying Mario can never have a game with a deeper story, even though it has, or that Disney and Pixar are not allowed to make a lower stakes slice of life movie that doesn't have a villain, even though they have. Again, it's just criticizing for what they want it to be and ignoring what it wants to be. Another thing this type of mindset seemingly ignores is that kids' movies in particular have to work within restraints of making it movies for children. Sometimes they find a good way around it, sometimes they don't. The Iron Giant is a beautiful film, but I doubt it would have resonated with kids if they didn't try to make it a fun family movie or add something a kid would be instantly invested in, like, a giant robot. But of course, none of this is going to change Matt's opinion on the film, and I don't want to do that anyway, because that's disrespectful, which is why this video is made for my audience rather than for Matt Walsh and his audience, and by extension his contemporaries. But I still feel that Matt Walsh is gonna take my video and lump it fit in with people who got triggered by his opinion and or his vocal minority of haters who happen to be a little mean to him. And if he does that, I'm gonna include this bit right here. I respect the fact that you didn't like Sonic 3. I acknowledge that you went out of your comfort zone for this movie. The only reason I'm using you as an example for this video is because I felt that you did a poor job in explaining your perspective and how you never expressed intent in what the movie wanted to be. Maybe it's my fault for reading too much into that title, but I came in expecting an interesting conversation on a movie by hearing out a perspective that happened to be different from mine, but all I got was from someone who couldn't have even paid attention to the movie because he didn't want to have a real conversation and chose to make baseless arguments and incompatible comparisons. And given the videos and clips I've seen from him, I can't help but feel that this is how he acts with other people. So I can't exactly separate the art from the artist in this case. But now, as we go back to addressing the audience, enough time has passed. It's time to stop calling videos, YouTubers, or arguments and the like bad solely because you disagree with them. It's time to start a different mindset where you go into a new video under the assumption that you might end up disagreeing with its ideas or its thesis even, so that you can scrutinize the video in good faith, get a feel for their perspective, and focus on what their arguments are actually trying to say, if they're saying anything at all. Unless if that opinion is inherently bigoted by nature and you're able to tell that after doing enough analysis, in which case, yeah, you can feel free to disregard it on principle and, by extension, their entire existence. But why can't I defeat you? Because we're Sonic Forces! Oh wait, said the line wrong. Ah!